By the time Caleb Mercer got the mare's hind leg free of the lower strand of barbed wire, his gloves were slick with blood that was mostly the horse's and a little of his own, and the light had gone that thin blue color the prairie used just before it swallowed the road hole. The mare blew hard against his shoulder, shaking with the kind of fear that came after pain, not before, and he was talking to her low, the way he always did with creatures that had more fright in them than fight. When he heard the small voice from the gate ask if they could sleep in his barn, he turned so fast the wires sang. A little girl stood in the dusk holding the broken leather trace of a wagon harness like it belonged to someone stronger. She could not have been more than 8. Her coat was too light for the cold coming on. One shoe had been tied at the ankle with twine, and behind her, half in shadow, a wagon leaned against one damaged wheel, while a woman sat on the bench with both hands tied around the reins, as if letting go of them would mean letting go of everything else as well. Caleb looked from the child to the road beyond them and saw no man, no outrider, no lantern swinging in the dark. Only the long empty line of country and the first breath of night. If this story finds you at a kitchen table or in a quiet chair with your hands still busy from the day, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Hard roads always feel a little less lonely when somebody answers back. The girl did not move nearer. She had the stillness of a child who had already learned that asking was easier to bear than being refused up close. Caleb set the cut wire aside, patted the mare once, and walked to the gate. Up close he could see the wagon had once belonged to decent people. The sideboards had been scrubbed recently. A cracked blue trunk was roped beneath a patched quilt. A skillet hung from one hook. A Bible, wrapped in flour cloth, sat beside a bucket with no handle. The woman on the seat kept her back straight in a way that told him more than any tears would have. Tired people slumped. Proud people held themselves upright until the bones near broke. She said they needed only a roof for the night. The horse had come up lame 3 miles back. The wheel had started to list after sundown, and the little one had been walking more than riding. They would be gone by first light. Her voice was calm, but the kind of calm a person used on a skittish animal or a frightened child. Caleb asked where they were headed. She said Willow Break. That made him look at her properly for the first time. Not because the name meant comfort, because it meant land, water, and trouble. The spring at Willow Break had been contested in whispers for 2 seasons, ever since Silas Rourke had begun stretching his fences farther than decent men pretended not to notice. Caleb said the barn was dry and clean enough. He told himself that was already more than he offered most folks. The girl nodded as if she had expected no better. Then the woman tried to climb down from the wagon and nearly pitched forward when her boot hit the hub. Caleb caught her by the elbow. She was lighter than he expected, all tendon and will, and cold through the sleeve. Not winter cold. The deeper kind. The kind that started inside a body and worked its way out. She thanked him without meeting his eye. The girl, who had been waiting with the careful patience of someone older than her years, went at once to the horse's head and laid a mittenless hand against its neck. Caleb led them toward the barn and felt his yard change around them. As if every board and hinge had noticed strangers crossing a line he had kept hard for too long. The barn still smelled of hay, leather, old pine, and the sweet dust of feed grain. He had a clean stall and an empty tack room. He found a lantern, fetched water, and settled the mare with a practiced hand, checking the leg and the shoulder while the girl watched every move. The woman said her name was Annabelle. The girl was Tess. Caleb gave only his first name and let the rest sit. That suited him. Names had a way of turning into obligations. He ought to have left it there. Ought to have pointed to the straw in the tack room, the wool blanket hanging by the door, and gone back to the quiet house on the rise with its dark windows and locked second bedroom. Instead, he found himself noticing stupid, particular things. The hem Anna had re-stitched by hand in poor light. The way Tess rubbed warmth into the mare's ears before her own fingers. The cough Anna turned into her shoulder and tried to hide. The cracked wool rim that would not take them another mile without work. When he took a kettle to the pump, Tess followed with the bucket, dragging it when she thought he was not looking. He asked if she was always this determined. She said only when there was reason. He gave them soup because no decent person ate dry bread on a night like that. He carried the pot to the barn first, telling himself he still meant to keep the line where it was. Anna refused the house in the polite way of people who had been made to feel the weight of other people's rooms before. So they sat in the tack room with the lantern between them, and Caleb on an overturned crate by the door, and Tess drank 2 bowls so quickly she hiccuped into the second. Anna made her slow down. Caleb looked at the child's narrow wrists, at the red groove the trace leather had left across one palm, and remembered another small hand wrapped once around his thumb so tight it had made him laugh out loud in a room where he had been trying not to cry. He got up before memory could settle in him, and said he would mend the wheel at first light. The cold turned sharper after midnight. He heard the wind change before he heard the coughing. It was not much of a wind, just a hard slide of air down from the dark hills, enough to turn straw edges silver with frost and creep beneath door gaps. Caleb lay awake in the house as he always did for an hour before sleep, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the shape of his own quiet. Then came the sound again, smaller this time. Not Anna's. Tess. He sat up, cussed once under his breath, jammed his boots on without stockings, and crossed the yard bareheaded. The child had fevered in the night. Her cheeks burned and her breath skipped. Anna was trying to cool her with water from the bucket, but her own hands shook so badly the cloth kept slipping. There are moments when a life changes so quietly you only hear it later, the way ice gives under snow without thunder or warning. Caleb did not think. He lifted Tess from the cot, blanket and all, and she curled against his chest with the blind trust of exhaustion. Anna started to object, then saw where he was headed and stopped at the threshold of the tack room like someone who had reached a church door barefoot. The spare room in his house had not been opened for guests in 3 winters. Dust had no chance to gather there because he cleaned it every Sunday and hated himself for it every Monday. The quilt on the bed had belonged to Rose. The little cedar horse on the shelf by the window had belonged to the daughter who had lived only 19 days and still managed to leave a silence larger than the whole place. He got Tess into the bed, built up the stove in the corner room, and sent Anna for warm water. When she came back in, she saw the quilt, the neatly folded child's blanket at the bed foot, the shelf with the cedar horse, and she understood enough not to ask a single question. She sat by the bed and cooled the girl's forehead, while Caleb stood in the doorway, feeling like a man who had forced open a room in his own chest with a crowbar. Then hoofbeats sounded in the yard. He stepped outside to find Eli Pritchard, one of Silas Rourke's riders, under the moon with a folded paper in hand. It was notice from the bank. Caleb's note came due Monday. No extension. And, Eli added too casually, Mr. Rourke had heard a widow might be coming through headed for Willow Break. Said if Mercer was wise, he would not entangle himself in land that wasn't staying hers. Caleb looked back toward the warm square of light, where Anna bent over the child he had carried into Rose's room, and he knew before the paper quit rustling in his fist that nothing in his life was going back to where it had been that morning. Morning came raw and pale, with frost along the trough edge and a sky so clean it made the hills look nearer than they were. Tess's fever broke before dawn. By first light, she was asleep the deep, honest sleep of a child who had used up all her strength and borrowed some besides. Anna had not closed her eyes. Caleb found her in the kitchen standing over the stove, as if she was unsure whether she belonged near it. She had braided her hair again. People who were afraid of falling apart often started by putting themselves back in order where they could. Caleb set coffee on the table and told her the mare would travel after a day's rest, maybe 2 if he wanted the shoulder right. Anna said they had no money for lodging. Caleb said he had not asked for any. She thanked him with the same wary tone she used the night before, like gratitude had become dangerous in her life, and she was handling it with care. He spent the morning with the mare. Tess sat on the top rail wrapped in one of his old coats. Watching so closely, he could feel her attention like sunlight. Caleb cleaned the cuts, rubbed the shoulder, and showed the child how to keep the horse from favoring the bad leg when it shifted weight. The mare laid her ears back once, then softened under his hand. Anna came from the house carrying a basin of hot water and stood by without intruding, which he noticed more than he wanted to. When he loosened the halter to examine the jaw, the mare threw her head and nearly snapped the rope. Anna stepped forward without thinking, palm open, voice low, and the animal stilled. She watched the mare a moment and said, "Some things don't fight the halter because they're wild. They fight it because the last hands on them were cruel." Caleb looked at her then, not at the frayed cuffs or the road dust or the shadows under her eyes. At her. She met his gaze for a breath and then returned it to the horse, giving the line room to settle without pushing it. Tess repeated it softly, more to herself than anyone else, as if testing how truth sounded when spoken aloud. By noon they were in town because Tess needed shoes and Anna's cough needed a doctor whether she wanted one or not. Caleb drove the wagon himself after setting the wheel and lashing the sideboard. Harlan was the kind of town built less by hope than by stubbornness. False front buildings, a smithy with one bent chimney, feed sacks stacked against the mercantile wall, dust thick enough on the main street to remember every wagon that passed. People noticed when Caleb Mercer came to town with a woman and child on his bench. Mrs. Dory from the boarding house noticed first and openly, squinting over her spectacles that were forever sliding down her nose. The barber noticed from his doorway. Sheriff Lyle noticed from beneath the brim of a hat too new for a man that idle. By the time Caleb had Tess measured for boots, half the street had worked out 3 versions of the story and chosen the unkindest one for comfort. Dr. Webb said Tess was run down and chilled, but not in danger. He said Anna's cough came from weeks of dust and too little rest, and gave her a bottle that smelled of licorice and camphor. At the mercantile, while Tess ran her finger down jars of striped candy she knew better than to ask for, Silas Rourke came in from the far aisle and stopped with his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He was one of those men whose calm had been mistaken for fairness, so often he no longer needed to raise his voice. Broadcloth coat, clean nails, silver watch chain. He greeted Caleb like a man acknowledging an equal for the sake of the room, then turned that polished attention on Anna and asked if she was Thomas Bell's widow. When she said yes, the store seemed to lean toward them. Rourke told her Willow Break was poor land for a lone woman and a child. Too isolated, too dry in the late season, too difficult to work without a crew. He said he would relieve her of the burden and settle a fair sum into her hand by sundown. Anna asked what burden he meant, since she had yet to set foot on what was hers. Something in the way she said it made Mrs. Dory look up sharply from the bolts of calico. Rourke smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He said the country had ways of deciding who could hold what. Caleb saw then what power looked like when it expected surrender before the struggle had even started. Not loud, not crude, just patient and certain that hunger would eventually do its work. At the bank, Amos Keene tapped the end of a pencil against his front teeth and told Caleb in a voice meant to sound private that Rourke had bought a share in the paper against the North pasture. Any man with sense knew what that meant. Caleb's note would not be called in public if he kept his place in the arrangement and let the Willow Break matter pass around him. He had a herd to feed through winter, a fence line needing replacement, and no wife or sons to spread the labor across. Keene did not say Anna's name, but both men heard it anyway. On the boardwalk outside, Anna stood with Tess and the paper sack holding the little boots. She had not needed to hear the words to know the shape of them. The look on her face when Caleb came out was worse. It had no surprise in it, only the tired recognition of another door beginning to close. That evening she told him they would leave the next morning and take a room at Mrs. Dory's until she could sell the land or find work. She said it while folding the blanket Tess had used, not looking up, making the sentence sound almost practical. Caleb went out to the barn and stayed there until dark because anger felt safer among animals than in a kitchen where 2 people were trying not to show each other how much the day had cost. When he came back, he saw Tess asleep at the table with a biscuit in one hand and the other curled around the cedar horse she must have found on the windowsill upstairs. Anna started to apologize. Caleb said nothing. He lifted the child, carried her back to the spare room, and when he came down, he took Anna's travel things from the tack room and set them by the stove in the house. Not a speech, not an invitation dressed as sacrifice, just a decision. Her mouth parted like she meant to argue, but the fight in her had burned too long already. She nodded once. After Tess was in bed, Anna told him what Willow Break was meant to be. Thomas Bell had taken survey work wherever he could get it, and years back he had bought the tract cheap because of the spring. Everyone else had looked at the stony ground and the bad road and seen trouble. Thomas had seen water and a narrow stand of cottonwoods that could break wind for a house if a body planted right. He died east of Cheyenne with fever on him and the deed papers tucked into his Bible. Since then, every person who heard the name Willow Break had either offered pity or a purchase price. Caleb listened with one forearm on the table and felt something inside his old habits begin to shift. He knew land the way other men knew scripture. Water changed every argument in cattle country. So did a woman stubborn enough to keep moving toward it after the man who had believed in it was gone. By the third morning the sky had gone pewter, and the pressure in the air made the horses toss their heads before the weather had even decided itself. Caleb had not yet said what choice he meant to make, perhaps because saying it would make it costlier. Anna, practical to the bone, began repacking the wagon after breakfast. He watched her tuck the medicine bottle into flour cloth, fold the quilt edges inward, lift what had become her life until it fit again into a few careful bundles. Then he went to the shed, brought out the drill, the shovel, the small crate of tools, and loaded them beside the wheel grease. She stopped and stared. He said he wanted to see the spring at Willow Break before any fool sold it out from under her. That was all. But the look Tess gave him from the porch step had the bright shock of a child watching a promise arrive in work clothes. And if you've ever been at the place where helping one soul might cost you the roof over your own head, you know the question sitting there with them. Do you keep what you can save for yourself, or do you risk it for someone with nowhere left to go? Caleb climbed to the wagon seat, flicked the reins, and chose the harder road before fear had time to offer him a better one. Willow Break lay 6 miles west over shallow rises and one mean patch of limestone that could crack an axle if a man got lazy. They found the cottonwoods first, all yellow leaves and black limbs, huddled along a fold in the land where the spring should have been. They found Rourke's fence second. New posts. Good wire. Too good for a line that was supposed to have been there for years. The gate carried no brand, which told its own story. Beyond it, the ground dipped toward a trickle half buried in mud where cattle had been watered hard. Someone had run too many head through a place not meant for them and called it theirs by sheer repetition. Caleb swung down, crouched at the seep, and rubbed wet earth between his fingers. Under the churn and filth, the water was clean. He moved fast then. Fast for him, which meant quiet and certain. He paced boundaries using the marks from Anna's deed, checked the old stone cairn Thomas Bell had described, and found it kicked apart 50 yards north of where it belonged. He looked at the wheel ruts, the cut willow stumps, the boot prints half stamped by hoof. Tess found a rusted hinge plate in the grass and carried it over like treasure. Anna stood in the middle of her own land with her arms around herself, not from cold this time. From the strange hurt of seeing a place you had loved in your mind before you ever reached it and finding another man's appetite all over it. Rourke arrived with 2 riders before noon, as if the land itself had sent word. He sat a dark gelding and surveyed the 3 of them with mild disappointment, the way a schoolmaster might look at children who had insisted on making a mess he would now be required to correct. He said Caleb had not taken his hint at the mercantile. Caleb said hints were wasted on him. Rourke gave a brief smile at that and turned to Anna. He said abandonment papers could be filed by week's end. Taxes had likely lapsed. Improvements were non-existent. Her husband had been foolish to think a woman could hold a spring against men with cattle. But because he disliked watching families struggle, he would still assume the burden. The phrase almost made Caleb laugh, though nothing in him felt like laughter. Anna asked to see proof of tax lapse. Rourke said the county seat was far and paper slow. Caleb asked why a man so certain of his claim had built a fence without the courtesy of a posted line. Rourke's riders shifted in their saddles. Rourke's calm thinned, not enough for most folks to notice, but enough for Caleb. Then he laid the offer plain. Anna could sign the tract over by tomorrow afternoon, and Caleb's note at the bank would be forgotten. The north pasture would remain his through winter. The herd would not be touched. Or she could refuse, and both of them could discover how expensive pride became in a country that counted survival in feed and water before anything noble. Tess stood very still between them, one hand pressed against her mother's skirt. Caleb saw Anna's fingers tighten in the fabric near the child's shoulder. There it was. Not just whether they would lose, whether they would be forced to lose in a way that made them betray themselves on the road to it. Caleb said no before Anna could answer. One word. Flat as an axe blade. Rourke looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded as if the result had only confirmed what he already knew about lonely men and their poor judgment. He touched his hat to Anna, turned his horse, and rode off without haste. On the way out, one of the riders let the gate slam wide so hard it cracked against the post. Little things told you what sort of war a man preferred. Not the clean one in public, the constant needling kind, the sort that wore a life down from the edges. That night the first trouble came small. A section of Caleb's south fence was found cut clean through, and 3 yearlings wandered nearly a mile before he and Anna ran them back by lantern light. Then the chickens set up a racket and the hound began a barking fit that meant strangers rather than coyotes. Caleb ran from the bunkhouse carrying only a shovel handle, and the hay lean-to behind the barn was already burning in one corner, fire taking dry straw with greedy little snaps. No thunder, no omen, just a tongue of orange in the dark where there should have been none. He shouted for Anna to get Tess clear and went in low under the smoke to drag the stacked bales away from the wall. Sparks hit his neck. The mare screamed in her stall. For one still instant, with the smoke banking down and the old pine timbers answering heat with soft cracks, he knew exactly what a man feels when something he failed once before stands in danger of being taken again. He got the fire stopped before it reached the main roof, but not before a beam came loose and glanced off his shoulder hard enough to send him to one knee. Outside, Anna had Tess wrapped in a wet blanket by the trough, both of them streaked with ash. One of the wagon side boxes had been forced open in the confusion, its contents half spilled into the dirt. Shirts, a skillet lid, a bundle of letters tied in blue thread, a rag doll flattened by travel. Tess wrenched free of Anna and snatched up the doll with a cry so fierce it made both adults turn. She clutched it to her chest, then, through hiccuping breaths, admitted she had hidden papers inside the doll's back weeks ago because she had seen 2 men searching their wagon at a camp east of town and had heard her father once tell her mother that papers mattered most when somebody powerful wanted them not to. Anna stared, then sat down right in the mud as if her knees had quit belonging to her. Caleb took out his pocket knife, slit the doll's seam carefully, and drew from the stuffing a waxed envelope thin as a flapjack. Inside were a tax receipt stamped current for the tract at Willow Break, and one loose page from Thomas Bell's field notes, the spring measurement corrected in his own hand. It did not solve anything. Rourke could still lean on the bank, the sheriff, the slow machinery of men accustomed to getting their way. But it changed the shape of the fight. Now there was truth in hand, not only in memory. Caleb looked from the papers to Tess, filthy-faced and trembling and stubborn enough to have carried proof across half the territory sewn into a doll. Worth had a way of hiding in the smallest package on the wagon. By morning his shoulder had stiffened, the hay lean-to smoked in a blackened heap, and Amos Keene's clerk had posted notice of seizure on Caleb's gate. Auction of livestock and equipment. 48 hours. Caleb took the papers, and Anna took a clean dress from her trunk, and neither of them said what both knew. If she sold to Rourke now, everything could still be stopped. At the bank in Harlan the following day, men gathered on the boardwalk with the ugly interest crowds always found in other people's near ruin. Rourke stood inside by Keene's desk with a contract already laid out and a fountain pen waiting beside it. Anna read the first lines, folded the paper once, and went pale. Caleb, standing 3 steps back with his arm locked in pain against his ribs, saw something pass across her face that frightened him more than anger would have. Resolve born from love and grief at once. She turned toward the desk, and with Tess pressed to her side and the whole town listening through the open windows, she reached for the pen to sign away Willow Break before his cattle were counted in the yard. Caleb did not stop her with force. He would not have, even then. He said her name once, low and rough, and whatever was in it made her look up. They left the bank without signing, but only because Amos Keene, who liked his money more than drama, agreed to hold the paper until noon the next day if Anna could prove the tax receipt lawful and the tract properly recorded. It was not mercy. It was leverage. Still, it bought time, and time is sometimes the most generous thing a frightened life can be given. Back at the ranch, when Tess finally slept from sheer fright and exertion, Anna sat at Caleb's kitchen table with his arm bared to the shoulder while she cleaned the burn and bound the bruise where the beam had struck. The room smelled of boiled linen, coffee gone cold, and pine smoke that had got into everything. She asked him, without softness and without accusation, who Rose had been. He had not heard the name in another person's mouth inside that house, and so long it felt like hearing a floorboard speak. So he told her, not beautifully, not from the beginning. He told her Rose had laughed easy and worked harder than any 3 men he knew. He told her the baby came too early in a sleet storm and the doctor did not reach them in time, and afterward, he had gone on feeding stock and fixing tack and paying notes because that was what was left to do. He told her he had kept the spare room ready because closing it felt like burying them twice. but opening it to anybody had felt like theft. When he finished, the kitchen clock sounded too loud. Anna sat with the bandage in her lap, and her own grief plain at last in the set of her mouth. She said Thomas had died in a bunkhouse among strangers while she was 2 counties away, and she had never forgiven the world for making his last room a borrowed one. Then she looked at him the way people do when they have decided not to protect themselves with politeness anymore, and she said, "I don't need you unhurt. I need you honest." He shut his eyes once, opened them, nodded. It was a small thing from the outside, likely. A man sitting at his own table, while a woman with road dust still in her hem told him the plain terms of being seen. But the whole house felt different after it, as if some draft that had lived in the walls for years had finally found its way out. Tess cried out from the spare room not long after, caught in the kind of half-dream children carry after fire and long roads. Caleb went upstairs, took the cedar horse from the shelf, and put it in her hand before she woke enough to know what she was holding. She curled her fingers around it and settled. Anna watched from the doorway with tears she did not wipe. Neither of them spoke. At first light, they went to the county clerk with the receipt, the field note, and the original deed wrapped in flour cloth. Mrs. Dory rode with them in the back without being asked, jaw set and black hat tied down with a ribbon that had seen better years. She claimed she was heading into town for lamp oil. No one believed her, and everyone appreciated the lie. At the clerk's office, Amos Keene suggested, in the oily, reasonable tone of a man who disliked uncertainty, that Anna add Caleb's name to the tract for protection since he was, after all, the one carrying the practical burden of the fight. It would have been easy. Useful even, a lawful way to take more than he was owed and call it prudence. Caleb looked at the paper, looked at Anna, and said the land belonged to Thomas Bell's widow and daughter, and that was the end of it. Mrs. Dory, standing by the window with both hands on the head of her cane, saw the whole exchange and said nothing. But her eyes sharpened with a kind of private approval that only made the room more still. The clerk recorded the tract. The tax receipt held. Thomas Bell's correction note was entered into the file. Rourke could not claim abandonment now without showing his teeth in ways polite town business preferred not to admit existed. He left the office with his hat on his head and his dignity mostly intact, which was likely more than he deserved and exactly as much as the moment required. The harder part came after. Paper could prove ownership. Paper could not make water run clean or pasture hold through winter. That took labor. So Caleb hitched a team, and Anna rolled her sleeves, and they went to Willow Break with tools, ditch boards, and the stubborn energy of people who had finally stopped asking whether the work would be worth it. Word spread in the soft rural way it always had. A man at the smithy heard about the blocked spring. His brother came by with spikes. Mrs. Dory sent bread. Doc Webb sent liniment, and an opinion nobody had requested. By the second day, 2 neighboring ranchers who had endured Rourke's prices for water longer than they liked admitted that if the spring were opened right, they would trade labor for future access. If what just passed between those two reached somewhere tender in you, stay close to this kind of story. Give it a like, subscribe if you haven't, and keep coming back for the quiet truths that make a long day feel a little less heavy. Some of us need reminding that kindness is not weakness and that being chosen, even late, still counts. They found the old stone basin under the silt and brush. They set the marker cairn back where Thomas Bell had measured it. Caleb showed Tess how to brace her boots and hold the shovel with her lower hand as the fulcrum. Anna, who could keep numbers straight under more strain than most men could keep their tempers, began a ledger for tools, labor traded, seed bought on credit, and the future hay cut they would need to make the whole thing stand. She and Caleb argued once over where to site the first little corral, and once over the width of the ditch gate, and both times ended up laughing halfway through because the fight was not about leaving. It was about building. There was a world of difference. By early winter, the first miracle did not look like one. It looked like water moving where it had been stopped, a narrow silver thread widening into a trough, soaking the edge of a field no one had believed would answer. The second miracle looked even plainer. Amos Keene standing in Caleb's yard, hat in hand, reviewing Anna's ledger and Caleb's projected horse sales, while 3 neighbors waited to sign agreements for spring water shares and hay contracts come thaw. Numbers did what sentiment never could. Keene saw a future revenue line, secured labor, recorded ownership, and a man who no longer stood alone in every calculation. He extended the note. Not out of generosity, out of arithmetic. That suited Caleb just fine. Rourke's strength had always depended on being the only bridge across a hard river. Once another crossing existed, folks stopped praising the old toll. Silas Rourke came once to Willow Break in late January, when the cottonwoods were bare and the air smelled of iron and snow not yet fallen. He sat his gelding by the reset boundary stones and watched Caleb and Anna setting posts for a new side gate. Tess, red-cheeked in a knitted cap Mrs. Dory had made too large on purpose, was teaching the hound to sit with commands it ignored. Rourke looked at the fresh ditch line, the stacked cut hay under tarp, the neat figures in Anna's ledger when she turned a page with a gloved thumb, and whatever argument he had written out with must have soured in his mouth. He said the place looked different, worked honestly. Caleb drove the post one last inch with the maul and answered that most things did. Rourke inclined his head once, perhaps because there was nothing left to say in a world where evidence had already taken the floor, and rode away smaller than he had arrived. The rest came in pieces that mattered because they were ordinary. Tess stopped asking before entering rooms. Anna's cough disappeared. Caleb quit waking at every creak in the house because there were now other breathing sounds to answer the dark. When spring truly broke, they put a table under the cottonwoods at Willow Break and ate there after a day of fence setting, tin plates on a checked cloth, with the ditch talking softly nearby. Tess fell asleep against the dog before sundown. Anna gathered the cups and Caleb took them from her without asking, and after a while she did not bother protesting the habit. He had never been a man for speeches, so when he asked her if she meant to keep two households for the rest of her life, when one would plainly do, it came out while he was tightening a trace chain and looking at the harness instead of her face. Anna stood very still, then said she had grown fond of one particular house and one particularly difficult man in it. That was answer enough. Years later, people in Harlan would remember the winter Rourke lost Willow Break as if it had been one hard contest of wills decided in a single noon. It never was. It was dozens of smaller things. A child sewing proof into a doll. A woman refusing to sell from fear. A man opening one locked room and finding the rest of his life waiting there. By the second autumn, the little house above Caleb's yard had a wider porch, Tess's school slate hung by the door, and Anna's marigolds pushed bright as coins along the fence line she and Caleb had argued over all spring. At supper, with beef stew thick on the stove and wind pressing gentle at the windows, Tess set the cedar horse between the salt and the lamp as if it had always belonged at the center of the table. Caleb looked at the warm square of room around him, at Anna reaching for his cup before he asked, and understood at last that grief had not been guarding the house. Love had simply been waiting for the latch. Empty rooms don't stay empty when love learns the latch. Outside, the barn door stood wide to the gold of evening, while three horses cropped the grass and Tess's laughter drifted across the yard like something that had always lived there. And if you like this one, stay with me for the next story, because next time I'll tell you about the war widow who found a railroad pay ledger hidden in her husband's tool chest, and the station master who realized too late she could read every number in it. Until then, sleep warm.